Good to see you all. My name is Stefan Polino. I'm chairing this meetings with Teaching Ability Institute. It's really delighted to have this presentation of this book, which, by the way, has an absolutely beautiful title. I mean, which David himself has selected. So you did a good job. And you have a good editor. You're very accepted. So, and it's a very interesting book. So, let me say something about the author, David. I have long karma with him. He first was my student when he was doing a master degree, and he totally thrilled me because he's the first student I ever met who had read Redistribution. And Redefined is very important in my thinking about his book about Homo hierarchicus and all that. So, in fact, you find some references in the book to that early days. But then David was my student in Pisa and moved on and did a PhD, and now he's working in the Italian government. And I want to insist that whatever he says here today, he says it in his private capacity as an academic, because he's also teaching at the Comparative University in Rome. And he does not in any way speak for the government or anyone else but himself. So that is a quick introduction to David. Nina from Karen is a professor in Helsinki. She's, I think, mainly Finnish, but also half, quarter, whatever, Dutch. She's worked both in the Netherlands and now at the University of Helsinki. And she's professor for social policy and also the head of the public policy, social and public policy of the university there. So we have a real faculty director here, which is very honorable. And her specialty is comparative social policy, welfare state, change, transformation, all that, social security, unemployment, all the things that are super important and super nasty. So, this is nice to have her to comment on what Davide is going to tell us. And with that and much ado, please give us an idea of what's in your book.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. I'm delighted to see you. Let me take this. Yeah. So, I'm here to present my book that I call Varieties of Equality in European Welfare States, Multi-Disciplinary Approach to Redistribution. Now let's examine this title. Varieties of Equality comes from my adherence of several social policy models that start their premises from Esping Andersen's 3 worlds of welfare capitalism, which I believe you're confident in, and goes up to Varieties of Capitalism of Peter Hall and David Soskis, and then builds on the social policy work mostly to provide a multidisciplinary perspective of what happens to income and wealth on the economic side and what is the political and cultural context that embeds certain choices of certain states to approaches to how to pursue equality. So, well, let's just introduce you immediately to my argument. After studying so much about social policy and equality over the course of my PhD with Stefan, I started wondering the most simple thing, which turned out to be one of the most complex. So what's equality nowadays? What is equality and how is it pursued as an ideal? How does it move into practice? And initially, as every researcher with the research question, you find this particularly you predict that this is easy to answer, but actually you kind of go and delve into all these sociologists, political thinkers that present equality in a way. And after such big literature review that I did, I came up with my own approach on how to define equality nowadays and bring equality back to the discussion in a context where there's a big changing landscape. And this big changing landscape comes in the form of recent trade wars and heightened global imbalances on the one hand. On the other hand, we just recently went out of pandemics, which rather surprisingly brought interstate inequality to a leveling, whereas within state inequality has risen ever since. And these main watershed events, in this case, are formed by kind of steer direction away from one of the main concepts, which I believe is the main component of our societies, which in terms of Western societies is deep in crisis and lies between many of the policy choices that will be made. So my argument is that equality comes in varieties. And nowadays, these varieties of equality are due to two major components. The first component is what I call the focal variability. I borrowed this concept from Amartya Sen, so stealing. But I take this and I try to operationalize this into what is it that's made equal. So equality in and of itself as an ideal is just a relation of sameness. Sameness as two things that share some property or part. You have to apply it somewhere. Someone has to choose what is equality and how it is applied. It can be applied to primary goods, income, wealth, opportunities, ends. And according to the different focal variability, the society may come up with different distributions and policy that address the distribution of income and of wealth. The second thing that I wanted to bring into the social policy literature is really the political context where policy choices are embedded. I call it normative context of social justice. This time I didn't steal much. I tried to consolidate several parts of the literature held by Amartya Sen a bit and Martha Nussbaum. But that defines the priority that the variety of equality has in a society's hierarchy of values. Now, the hierarchy of values are a ladder that are embedded into a constitution. And constitution in and of themselves establish trade-offs. And within these trade-offs lies equality as a principle. So in this case, sorry for the big tab, but this is the best combination that I could come up with. I applied my reasoning of these two components, the focal variability that you see over here and the normative context of social justice over here, to three main different ideal types of societies. Ideal types are those types that derive from concepts. And these concepts have been selected by me from a literature review from one of the main political thinkers that belong to Western traditions. And I have formed three major typologies for equality nowadays. The liberal egalitarian variety of equality, and I borrow the thought of John Rawls from this. The liberal variety of equality is the first one that concerns basic liberties first as focus, and then endowments and income afterwards. They're embedded within a normative context of social justice that kind of foresees equal basic individual liberties and subordinates inequalities to the enjoyment of these liberties. So this is a political liberalism society. But however, these differences are smoothened out to follow what is called the difference principle. The difference principle is that inequalities should benefit the least advantaged. This in couple with equality of opportunity. So how do we operationalize this in terms of economic and political analysis, quantitative? This is a society that I expect has medium to higher than average share of GDP allocated to social security levels. It's got a higher than average income Gini differential when it comes to tax redistribution. And inequalities exist because they are smoothed by generous redistributive policy, high commitment to transfers, low redistributive efficiency, just because society predicts and predilects the enjoyment of liberties first. The second one is what I call the libertarian variety of equality. Libertarian coming from Robert Nozick. Now, in this case, the focal variability is on holdings, so objects, goods, wealth, income in this case, but also entitlement and state of nature rights. In this case, these types of society ideally don't really pursue redistribution inequality, but actually say that inequalities are just if they follow certain principles of acquisitions, transfer, and rectification. In this case, inequalities are existing and they are just if they follow a certain procedure. And in this case, I mean, operationally, we just think of these countries, these libertarian countries, as showing low share of GDP in terms of transfers, low to medium redistribution, low redistributive efficiency, and basically not having a minimal state intervention in redistribution. The third one I borrow from Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. I call it the functional variety of equality, and it focuses mainly not particularly on income or on wealth, but on what is called capabilities. So capabilities in themselves are accesses to certain doings and beings so that people in general can access different states, such as reading, for example. Reading is a good function that allows you, in case you have it, to access higher up jobs and all other types of benefits. In this case, the normative context of social justice is particularly equal and universal in terms of access to functioning, and therefore translates into above average transfers, above average redistribution, and higher redistributive efficiency. So how do I disaggregate my research? Firstly, I take a look at the focal variability, my first argument that composes equality. What I wanted to do over here is to have a full stream quantitative approach to inequality. So I wanted to look as much as input to equality, from a society, which I operationalize as a percentage GDP for welfare transfers. I take this from ESPRO's database, that is European Social Protection Database. And I wanted to link it with the output to equality. And the output to equality is the amount of actual redistribution that the tax system has in a certain society. I define it to be as gross income Gini, which is pre-market, and minus net income Gini, which is disposable income. I then standardize according to a T distribution. And what I really want to study over here for a full stream approach to equality is the welfare performance that I define as the marginal reduction in inequality per expected unit of transfer. And we can see here the slope of the line, of the regression line, that is basically the derivative of the difference of the input divided the derivative of the output indicator. And for this, I set up a panel of countries and I smoothed out a study of more than 30 years of data for a panel of countries that we see over here. We see the trend line, the regression line that divides countries into more efficient than the average and less efficient than the average. And I basically name the two axes as the input and output performance indicators. So the x-axis is the transfers, percentage of GDP per social security schemes, and on the other hand, the tax redistribution. And we can see certain interesting things. These points are averages in 30 years, and we can see that countries cluster around two main camps. The first camp is highly committed towards transfers. So they have a higher than average commitment to transfers, and on the other hand, we have a quadrant where we have uncommitted and sometimes inefficient countries in terms of redistribution. We can see, first thing, that the Nordic countries, Anglo-Saxon countries, and continental countries tend to be over here in the quadrant. So we can see that, especially Norway, the UK, Austria, and Germany, over time, as an average that's standardized, have managed to redistribute more resources per unit of transfer that's expected. Whereas we can see that most Mediterranean countries, the United States, as much as certain Nordic countries and East European countries, go into the quadrant that's uncommitted, what I call uncommitted, and sometimes inefficient countries. So they are not really committed to transfers, and also they don't redistribute much with their tax system. So the second part of my book delves into the political context that makes these choices towards redistribution possible. My main argument, also drawing from the thought of Stéphane Collignon, is that prevailing political discourses and collective preferences, mainly in democracies, influence how states pursue inequality. And that's a rather easy comment to make, but it's more difficult to measure. So the normative context of social justice in this case, when we want to measure it, is a vector of what I call axiological preferences. So preferences of values. And that establish the trade-off between the pursuit of different types of equality as framed before. So how do we do this? This is just an excerpt. I mean, there's more variables over here, but I used the Comparative Project Manifesto, which is widely known database that examines what are called quasi-sentences within party manifestos for every election year for every country that's in the panel, which is basically all European countries and some Western countries, so between UK and United States, and where X in one policy category identifies the percentage of sentences in the party manifestos that are signed into predetermined categories, such as, for example, for freedom, equality, individualism, and you see collectivism over here, which I have chosen to be my axiological indicators, can be within these ranks, so favorable or negative mention towards certain issues. What I wanted to focus on here is to try to understand what political parties were discussing in terms of policy issues that are framed over here as a sample. And then what I wanted to do was to kind of operationalize this into two main axes. If we go back, these are the main axes. I plot freedom against equality and individualism against collectivism in terms of these shares of quasi-sentences by construction. So freedom in this case is the absence of constraint. Equality is redistribution with constraint. So that can be seen as antithetic. So one society can lead either can bend towards either freedom or equality if we accept this definition. Second definition is individualism and collectivism. Individualism is the prevalence of the rights and interests of individuals over the interests of the collective. And collectivism is exactly the opposite and proxies for hierarchy. So by doing this, and then we're going to talk about it, I set up a panel of countries that basically distribute within 4 quadrants. And these 4 quadrants are exactly framed in the axes: liberty and equality, individualism, and what I call collectivism or holism, meaning hierarchical relations. And in this case, we can see some results over here as well. Most countries that are Northern European, Anglo-Saxon, or in this case, Nordic, are bending towards higher levels of individualism. Again, this is averages. So I look at the content of comparative project manifestos over time, and I normalize them, and I weight them for vote percentage of these parties that have lead in the manifesto. So what can we see is our society's normative context of social justice. So certain societies that have a more individualist and liberal approach are over here. Other societies that are bended towards freedom rather than equality and are collectivist are over here, and so on and so forth. What's really interesting to me is that by combining these two types of components of equality, focal variability on the one hand, and normative context of social justice on the other hand, we can see some preliminary results. So this is the Pearson coefficient. It's just a correlation coefficient. So it doesn't really imply causation. But already from here, when you study the panel of Eurozone countries and then also the full panel of industrialized countries, what's really interesting to see is that first, social spending and redistribution may go together. And then we're going to see how. But in and of itself, redistribution also goes together with preferences towards equality rather than freedom. And that's rather unsurprising. What's surprising is that redistribution in general goes hand in hand with individualist societies. So I don't know if you see the argument coming up and then being tested, is that individualist societies, those that place individual liberties and individual interests over the interests of the collective in general, tend to have higher equality and redistributive efficiency. So, I mean, these are the statistical results that go beyond my book. In my book, I set up the framework, and then with Stefan, we conducted a study that basically looked at the relationships between economic indicators such as GDP growth, percentage of GDP spending on social security, and other types of variables such as total population and the degree of openness in trade, to predict the preference of certain countries within freedom rather than equality, or the opposite, or certain preferences within individualism or collectivism on the other. And what is interesting to look at is that firstly, we've checked for fixed effects, and we've done all the controls for that are needed. In terms of the modeling, the R-square is particularly interesting. It's 0.7, so it's a good prediction for the model, especially as the fact that what we can see most importantly and interestingly is that government spending tends to relate with government spending on social security tends to relate with individualism as much as GDP growth also tends to go hand in hand with individualism. So these are the main results that I wanted to present to you, just to spur some discussion over what we're doing today with equality in countries. And my conclusion about the question that I set forth to answer in my book is: what's conceived and pursued to be equal? What are the effects of each variety? Well, I contend that there are three main ideal types that can become empirical typologies: the functional variety that shows above average redistributive efficiency, the liberal egalitarian that shows higher than average commitment to transfers and redistribution, and the libertarian one that shows lower than average redistributive efficiency and redistribution, and also low commitment to transfers. Have nowadays welfare states pursued different or similar routes to equality? They cluster on certain counts: the functional variety of equality, that is redistributively efficient, committed, and on average individualistic, and the libertarian part, so the redistributively inefficient and on average less committed countries to transfers that are also on average associated with greater hierarchy. So these are basically the results of my studies and the studies that we have done with Stefan. And I look forward to the comments of Minna and your comments. So thank you.
Now we know that even equality is not equal. So I'm very interested to hear what Minna is going to tell us now.
Well, at least I will have no formulas in my presentation, so that's a lucky strike for the audience.
Just click.
Yeah,
pretty much.
There's
There's gonna be a lot of, yeah.
there's going to be a lot of clicking. No?
You get there.
I will get there.
There you go. Nice.
Yes, and that's like the free advertisement for my university. So hello everybody. My name is Minna van Gerven, and I'm indeed a professor of social policy from University of Helsinki. And I'm really excited to be here today. And I would like to thank you, of course, Davide and LSE European Institute for this event and allowing me to come and discuss. I'm also very, very grateful for, of course, our moderator. So I think it's important to have a strict moderation going. So thank you. And I think with Stefan, we are in good hands. And so really thanks for Edward Elgar and Helen, of course, for publishing this book. I think you all agree with me that this book arrives really at the right time. Really, the current political debates are preoccupied by things relating to global power rivalry or strategic competition or pursuit of national interest and strength and supremacy. And I think we all are kind of witnessing this. And the last week's World Economic Forum, Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister's eloquent portraying of the shift really kind of resonates to many things that are to come when we also talk about equality and its position in the current world within this hostile political environment where the European welfare states are trying to kind of maintain also their normative foundations. And I think we also agree that the European welfare states, as a social policy professor, witnessing these developments over decades, is really struggling to find their way, especially in the current landscape, also full of different kind of competing policy goals, which are very much then relation to what Davide is talking about, this hierarchy of these values. So you have not only the welfare concerns with respect to equality and equal redistribution, but you also deal with other things like, well, let's say military defense, social security, cybersecurity, climate adaptation, energy transition. There are very many different kind of new kind of concerns that our governments have to find solutions for. So therefore, organizing welfare and equal redistribution of wealth is only one of these issues that are competing in the national and also international agendas. I think, rephrasing to our Finnish president, I'm talking about my government now, but still, what the Finnish President Alexander Stubb has really termed as that we are in the era of the value-based realism. The welfare states really need to find a positioning with respect to equality as well. And it no longer sustains as a self-evident principle, rather it requires competition with other kind of values, as Davide has really nicely portrayed in his book. I'm not going to very much into the nitty-gritty of the discussions. You need to buy the book and read it from there. I'm also not going very densely into the empirical findings. We can also return to those when we are having this Q&A. But I would like to blunder a bit more on the theoretical aspirations that are behind of this book, and also trying to kind of show the value and the power that this book has also for me as a social policy scholar, somebody who's interested in comparative social policy. And I really think that the main contribution of this book really lies in the conceptual clarity of it. It brings it to new understandings of equality and tries to systematically then, of course, link that to the concrete patterns of welfare state design and policy choices. And I think in itself, this is already a valuable contribution. Of course, there are challenges when we are starting to deal with ideal types, especially when it comes to welfare redistribution. We all know that countries are very, very different with respect to the way that they redistribute wealth. They are very different kind of functional equivalence, for example. Some countries deal with tax, others deal with social security, some deal with risk, for example, with through labor market regulation, directives, and trade union side of things. So, you know, there are very many things of ways of organizing this. So therefore, of course, there are also some limitations to the way that Davide is looking at only this particular way of policy making. But I think it really has much value to understand where we are. And I think the equality question really is one of the main values and this kind of additions to our discussions about welfare state change. And I think it's really valuable the way that Davide's comparative cases, they show really clearly how same volume of social spending, for example, can really resonate in very different kind of outcomes, depending whether they are framed through the different equality varieties. So whether they are the stage towards the targeting, or whether they are universal, whether they are going towards a more capacity perspective, or whether it's more libertarian. So I think that is really the value, making these kind of mechanisms visible, and how this equality really translates into different kind of varieties of redistribution, but also varieties of policy intent. And I think that's really valuable. What I think is behind many of these ideal types and the kind of the trade-offs and the differences that we find in when reading Davide's book is basically the asymmetry of the economic and social interest. And I, of course, would like to hear from David's side whether he agrees. I think in many welfare states, including my own home country in Finland, not being an exemption, we really have a shift towards, portraying social policy and welfare state core action as more as like diminishing economic growth. Is something that is called also in the literature as more like a leaking bucket rather than an irrigation system that would make our societies flourish. But I think this has to do with the subordination of the social policy goals to the economic priorities, which are very deeply entrenched in the way that our institutions are built up in the European states, but also in European Union. So if you think about, for example, the influential work of Fritz Scharf, now that we are the European Institute, we can really refer to this kind of differences and this asymmetry between for the economic and social interest, where the market-based, market-correcting integration has been really rapid, whereas the market-correcting social protection has been really very fragmented and lacking behind. So I think David's book really demonstrates that equality has not disappeared from European states. I think that's already a valuable result. Rather, it has really persisted and re-emerged through different kind of ideas and new practices, new policy instruments. And I think I was really interested, you didn't talk much about, especially when it comes to equality, I think the developments in the European welfare states have been very much embedded in the understanding of social investment as kind of like a paradigm change that we have seen in the welfare states. So to what extent your research results resonate with this idea of social investment states? And just for those who are not aware of the topic, so social investment really tries to engage into a broader understanding of social policies and welfare states, not only repairing, not only addressing risks, but actually trying to prepare, promote, and protect human capabilities across the life course. And in many cases, this kind of social investment strategies, they are built on the Nordic tradition of combining not only the high or at least adequate cash benefits with these kind of universal or at least semi-universal public services. And closest that I come to social investment in David's book is of course, referring to this capabilities approach in your functional equality. So that is, of course, kind of where we touch ground with this idea of social investment. But I also think that, as we can see, and I think that is the main criticism of my reading of your work, is that when we are focusing only on social protection and redistribution, we focus on, cash benefits, in-kind expenditures, but we actually overlook the qualitative role of public services. So where are the public services in here? So if you look from the perspective of equality, so we have a lot of research showing that it is the design, accessibility, but also the quality of public service. Whether it's education, healthcare, social care, long-term care, but they are really crucial in shaping the inequalities and equalities in everyday life. So I was wondering, where does the social investment strategies hit in? And I also think that when we are talking about these ideal types, as you have portrayed nicely, that helps us understanding this kind of analytical rigor. It basically also misses out a little bit of this idea that, especially in many social investment paradigm reforms, we are going to combine benefits with services. And ultimately, it is at the intersection, I would say, of these different policies rather than individual instruments or ideal types where actually the greatest gains for equality are then actually achieved. Then going to the paradox of redistribution, I really love this. I always put my children, my students, to read the Walter Korpi and Joachim Palme's old paper by now on the paradox of redistribution. And why is that? Well, basically, if you, for example, look at the current political debate on welfare states, the main argument is that what we need to do is we need to, because the welfare states are not doing so well economically, so what we need to do is we need to target and select more carefully where we actually invest this money. And I think the Corby and Palmer's paradox has been really influential in trying to at least have the academic discussion about the idea that the more we actually are targeting, especially exclusively to the poor, the less we actually do reduce poverty and inequality. And I think it's really valuable that David's book actually builds on this argument, and actually you show that it is not that universalism and targeting is a simple dichotomy. Rather, you actually show that it really matters under which condition targeting can be justified and under which universalism may be indispensable. But again, it's usually not either or. You need to have both of these sides in order to make the nuances. Because we all love Bent Greve, I also wanted to point out the convergence. I think your results also show that there is convergence, but also you said in the pandemic, after the pandemic, what we actually see is that there's a convergence maybe between the countries, but the divergence takes place within the societies. And I think that is really an important part of understanding inequality. I think the current way of measuring it, however, is somewhat lacking behind. So I think we need still better indicators to actually make these elements more aware. And I think your future work might be helpful in improving also on that part. The final thing before we move to the conclusion is the technology. And even though you didn't mention a word about technology, I had to take up this opportunity to actually talk about this point, because I think what we see is that technology is a very influential tool that actually will make the welfare states more efficient on the one hand, but also it allows them to be more selective and more targeted. So the data and technology today, they really increasingly define who is seen as the deserving for state support, under what conditions, and also with what degree of individualization. And I think your work really nicely also gives us tools to actually understand better also how welfare states, not only the policy design, but also the technology design actually will help us to highlight some of that. I think you made the explicit normative trade-off so visible, and it really allows also us to assess how the digital welfare tools, they should really promote inclusion rather than intensify selectivity. So, return to the core message. I think what you have really nicely shown is that the equality is plural, but it has always been plural. And unless we specify what equality is, we will continue to design policies that fail to meet expectations. And I think your book really offers powerful tools to reopen these debates about universalism versus selectivism, about redistributions, how welfare state can remain legitimate, both socially but also economically. In that sense, it really kind of affirms that equality is not luxury, especially in the current world order, but it is a foundational principle of European social model, and therefore also very much worth of defending. So let me end by congratulating you, Davide, for this thoughtful, rigorous, and deeply relevant book. It challenged me, and I'm sure all the readers who read it, to think more clearly of the values and the hierarchy of the values that we have in our welfare states. It gives us the analytical tools actually to debate those values, and therefore it helps us not only that the equality remains on the table, as you kind of point out, but actually that it stays in the very center of our public policy imagination. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. That was a very thoughtful and deep discussion, and that is really wonderful to get that on a book like this. If I may add one just little thought to it, is like, a priori, it's kind of puzzling to hear that it's the countries that seem to be individualistic and let's call it liberal in the American sense of the word, are the ones who are redistributing most. I don't think it's such a contradiction. Why? Because what that individualistic culture means is you take care of individuals, of people as human beings that deserve equality. That is, I mean, that is the nature of liberty in the broad sense, not just freedom a la Friedman, but freedom always implies equality, because unless we are free, we are not equal. And it's the freedom itself that makes us equal. So in that sense, to respect another person means to respect also the equality that we have between human beings. And therefore, it means also that we recognize the moral imperative to say, if there is something wrong, we need to remedy it because they're human beings who deserve that. And I think that's a kind of, you can call it ethical, moralistic, or whatever context that is also in the concepts that David shows us in these major philosophers and so on. But it is also something that is ingrained in the nature of the societies that we have in Europe. And I think that is really a beautiful flower that emerges from the book that we are reading here. So these are a few thoughts of mine that come from this discussion, but would you like to respond to anything that we have heard from Mina?
I would like to take also the audience
Yeah.
questions,
Yeah,
maybe,
yeah,
and
yeah.
then we can make.
Okay, good,
Yeah.
excellent. So who would like to? Yes, please.
I mean, my name is Arif
Just a second,
Azad.
we're bringing the microphone to you so people online can hear. Thank you.
And please say your name and where, what you do, and so on.
I mean, thank you very much for your, presentations, and you have actually your presentation and book gives like a new lens and new, typologies to approach, like in policy making. And yes, thank you very much. But my question is bigger and how the irresistible rise of, neoliberalism has affected equality debates and, policy making in Europe and in the UK. And second, it's also, political question, how the rise of, far right and its, emphasis on, cultural wars has also affected the debate on welfare state as a whole. Thank you.
Who else would like to ask a question? Yes, please.
Sorry. Hello, thank you so much. I really appreciate the talk. My name is Tyler. I'm a master's student in social and cultural psychology. I want to, about your talk, David, in the beginning you said that your hypothesis was under the pursuit of different qualities leads to the design of different political systems and economic structures. I was curious about how sub-nations fit into this theory. Because, for example, Wales you had UK in general over there, but they had a nation of sanctuary policy for refugees, which was proposed because of the hostile environment of the UK's policy, but used their devolved powers to create a better environment for refugees, such as education or transportation, to allow refugees to integrate more. So still within this welfare, but it derived because of the policies in place by the UK government. So they use the policies to drive their, and this happens in Basque Country as well. So I'm curious of how sub-nations fit into this framework. Thank you.
Okay, maybe we answer this because these are concrete questions.
Yes, good, okay. Maybe you also want to take your views onto some of them, so, but, I don't know. Do I get a? Oh, from here, okay, good, can you hear, okay. So, the first one, well, regards the, let's say, the prevalence in certain discussions of neoliberalism. In this case, this is a very broad question, right? Neoliberalism in and of itself, we firstly need to define what that is, and then we need to take into account what's the thinking of neoliberalism that prevailed for a certain moment, if there was a prevalence. So really, we need to frame this a little bit more with more awareness, because this might fall within a certain category of thinking that really is very broad. But the concept of neoliberalism, in my understanding, also guides a little bit the idea of redistributive efficiency. So neoliberalism in and of itself is basically one of the leading factors that ties redistribution and addressing inequalities to a certain efficiency on the one hand, and on the other, to economic performance. And this is particularly interesting actually for me, because like some of the recent studies that were put kind of advocate on the one hand theoretically, but also find empirically that higher equality, so less inequalities, contribute to greater economic growth. So on the one hand, we could start thinking about the fact that actually this is reasonable. I mean, more equalities in terms of income and wealth, and some of the things that we cannot measure also, that I tried to take into account, like capabilities, and which we can decline as social investments, can actually be seen, of course, as drivers of growth, especially when it comes to human capital, because capabilities are greatly related with human capital. So human capital is the ability of certain people and citizens and contributors to the economy to kind of access certain states of being or of doing, and certain higher dimensions, of course, that then in turn contribute to the economy. And as we know in, well, just like growth theory, long term, the solo residual is important. So human capital in general, and increased competences by people. So in this case, what could be interesting would also be to kind of put neoliberalism in this framework, the framework that greater equality and efficiency in equality, actually. So greater redistribution given transfers could actually lead to further growth, which could enhance to a certain point also the indicators that neoliberalism takes into account, that are also very important to some extent, because on the other hand, what neoliberalism to me emphasizes is that some prescriptions of certain ideologies like socialism in general can also not incentivize growth, or cannot incentivize also certain types of work performance that could hamper growth. But this is very relevant, so thank you very much. We can, I mean, let's keep discussing about this. And secondly, well, I mean, I just took some notes, so sorry if I just reframe your question to just, but this thing regarding my model accounting for regionalism, so regional differences rather than, so looking a little bit more into countries, right? And you look into a country's imagined community, and then of course it's fragmented into many municipalities, both administratively and also on the other hand, in terms of culture. So there's of course intra-country variation, and this is particularly important. I didn't do it here. So this is parts of the limitation of my study. What I tried to see was a very macro outlook, with a very big macro outlook that kind of links values in general to certain types of society. But in and of themselves, societies are clustered of communities that then kind of have their own institution and sovereignty to me. So of course, in this case, there's wider thinking about regional, it could be very interesting to see regional political cleavages affecting regional redistribution of resources. And that could actually be one of the further studies that I could do and that we could do also with Steph. So they very much welcome the question. So I don't know if any one of you has.
Yes, well, regional has much to do also with these services. Because even though, state level determined benefits are quite, that's quite standard. It should be at least across the country. But when it comes to services, then we are talking about a very different kind of diversity and inequalities, regional inequalities come very, very visible in that. But I would like to go back to the first question about the neoliberalism. I think I would be less in lines of not saying that we need to think about more about how to revise it or reframe it. I think what we can see in, for example, if you look at going back to the social investment debate in European Union, for example, that it has had a certain kind of neoliberal undertone in the sense that when we talk about social investment, especially the Nordic countries talking about reasonably generous benefits in vis-a-vis with these universal services, what you see is that the social investment in being framed as a social policy, making the productive factors also of the economic growth, also comes with a different kind of understanding of equality, not about equality of resources. So we are not aiming at, topping up the income levels of all citizens to a certain level. Rather, we talk about equality of opportunities. And basically, it's quite a different kind of framing. It has its roots, as I said, in the Nordic understanding of combining benefits and services. But still, if you take that as an example for a neoliberal way of thinking, you could say that living in a poverty, if you have a child, a single mother's child living in a poverty in a poor neighborhood, that is not per se a problem for social investments. It's only a problem if this child doesn't have the same opportunities to get to the university, for example, later on. But on the other hand, we also know that, growing up in poverty really does also has a negative impact for your life as a long-term perspective as well. So there is a kind of a nuance, I would say, that is behind of these questions about what is equality and where do we aim for it. So, but that's a social policy professor talking.
If I may add one other thing on this. In the English language, we have an enormous privilege because we have the word freedom and we have the word liberty. And I would argue that the word liberty is really the combination of freedom and equality. Why is that important? Because neoliberalism, in my eyes, has forgotten the equality part of freedom. And therefore, it's unbalanced. And that is what people respond to. And the consequence of that is the populism. And you see, like in terms of the graphs and the stuff that David showed us, I mean, where's Trump? He is down in the holistic side, He is not up at the individualism. And this is the response, And traditionally, what these conservative, authoritarian rulers always say is, the freedom for me, no one else, not equality. And I think that in that sense, what we are now living, the backlash of populism is the reaction to neoliberalism that has forgotten that freedom, that liberty includes both freedom and equality. Other questions, please.
I really appreciate the talk, so thank you very much. My main question was that I'm studying politics at school, and I was really interested in what kind of politicians or policies you see that really take off with these ideas of equality and freedom, and what in the last decade and looking forward maybe into the future seems to be taking off as an idea.
Let's add another question, maybe.
What would efficient redistribution of wealth look like to you? So which country in particular do you think has done this best?
We get back to 100 slides less famous. And we try to answer some of these things. So, so firstly, I wanted to react to Stefan's really nice connection between the neoliberalism side that has forgotten somehow the equality, the comprehension of equality within the word liberty. Now, in my own understanding, and as I frame these discourses, what's most important is that I put freedom against equality, but never liberty against equality, because we have highly talked about this, and the word is kind of carefully chosen. And in this case, what's most important about neoliberalism is that it really fell short also of, in my understanding, to address the long-term issues that itself raises. Because, for example, when it comes to efficiency in general, efficiency is always linked for countries that really have high debt to debt management. And I come from one of the countries that has highest debt and is really trying to manage it well and with efficiency. And the main issue with this is that there's traps in which countries can fall, especially in terms of policies, things that were asked. So policies in terms of monetary policy, in terms of fiscal policy, and related things. What neoliberalism did that was taking out the equality side in and of itself was also, in my understanding, the potential for growth that is given by the growth of human capital that is given by greater capabilities. So potential opportunities, as Mina also was saying. So going back on the second question that we have the graph for, I mean, again, this is an exercise to spur discussion. This is not the truth. I mean, this is my approach to quantitative methods is to have a rigorous analysis of indicators that we define and that underlie certain premises. Now, what this says, actually, I mean, if we plot transfers and tax redistribution, I mean, they are related, but they are not the same thing. So countries that score above the trend line, the regression line, are countries that redistribute more resources with their tax system than expected by the level of transfers. So in this case, what I tried to combine, and of course, I am also leaving out many variables, such as services within the focal variability. And I could definitely go into it, but I have to say that a PhD of 3 years gives you some limitations. Anyhow, that could be really interesting also to incorporate. But getting back to the question, countries that score above this line redistribute more resources than expected. This is my definition of redistributive performance. We can challenge it together, also build on it. But what I think is nice is that it gives you a sense of the expectation that you have for certain inputs for an output. And countries that have a greater output with regards to that input, then definitely can be said to be efficient in a way, because usually efficiency indicators are output over input or input over output and things like that. So indicators are synthetic measures that try to kind of compare realities. Of course, this forsakes regionalism, certain types of inclusions of indicators, and of course in the book, I mean, I just state my limitations. My main ambition on the book is to just bring the discussion back. It's not definitely to show that there's definite truth in the fact that, surprisingly, I don't know, Ireland kind of redistributes resources so much better than expected. But these are interesting findings. what I also find particularly interesting is that certain typologies that we see, ideal types, typologies, divisions, like southern countries, southern or Mediterranean countries, or Eastern European countries, tend to have certain features together when you aggregate them and you take the average. So this is also interesting. And therefore, I hope I answered the second question. And what policies do I see that could turn these sort of ideal types into realities? Of course, I mean, policies are intended as the action of states to address certain problems, right? And what actions should be taken? Well, this takes into account complex factors, right? I mean, if you have a very high debt, can you really redistribute resources with the same ease than countries that have lower debt? This is one of the dimensions that kind of is really up in the Italian policy debate that I also come from. And I have to say that I think that we need a rewiring of trust in general. And trust is a particular issue that I don't address in the book, but trust is basically everything. In terms of expectations, so positive expectations, and also in terms of markets. I mean, markets are driven by a shared sense of trust. And the trust into certain variables that impede the exercise of policy should be actually addressed in political discussions until we don't find a renovated trust to kind of enact policy, because policies are many. But I think that what nowadays is particularly important is the fact that the state is usually limited in doing some of the policies that could best address problems and could enhance virtuous cycles. And that's, I mean, one of the greatest examples also are Southern European countries in general that are stuck in high debt. And this is particularly important because when you have high debt, you can't really go and address things. This being only one of the major variables. So,
where is Finland in this?
oh, I think I didn't aggregate data for Finland, and I'm maybe
It's there.
No,
Okay.
maybe
It's there.
let's take a look. Oh, it's over there.
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Okay.
So the countries are many, but Finland is just rightly above. So it's just on the trend line. It's actually one of the closest to the trend line. So it commits as much as it redistributes according to my.
As long as we do better than Sweden.
Let's see where Sweden is. Well, Sweden is over there, so it tends to be a little more committed into the transfers, but doesn't redistribute differentially as best. So
Mina, I have a question. I'm a little bit puzzled by this, but I'm ignorant, okay? Denmark is sort of nearly an outlier in terms of transfers. But I don't think they have social transfers, social contributions. Everything is through taxes in Denmark, if I'm right.
No,
No?
there is quite a strong redistribution. It is true that some of the issues, like for example, employment policies, predominantly done through the trade union side contributions. So they might also look differently in this picture in that sense. But they are a big spender, and Denmark has this potential of what they call as flexicurity. So on the one hand, it's very easy to lay off people, but on the other hand, there is strong their contributory payments and services. They are very high on services as well in comparison to Finland and Sweden, for example.
And then we have Finland, which is doing slightly better than the expected one, and the Netherlands, which you know well, and where you have also studied local distribution or service stuff. How do you explain the difference between Finland and the Netherlands?
Well, I think it might be to do the way that social spending in Finland, they I think with the public spending, they actually include also some of the national pensions, and that's why it's the way that they have defined what is within the public spending, and the Netherlands does that not. So that's the difference. The way basically, if you would look by functional equivalence, you would see Netherlands at the same level as Finland.
So what you're saying is that in Finland, pensions are pay as you earn, and sort of the young pay for the old. And in the Netherlands, they are capital funded.
Yes, yes, there is this national pension system as well, but it's a tiny one.
Okay, good. Any other questions? Yes, please. Yeah, we have some questions from the viewers online.
We have a question by Vijay Srao. Do welfare states in neighboring countries compete with each other with respect to the promises they make about delivery of services to their populations, such as my welfare state is better than your welfare state?
Let me ask her another question. Does that mean the competition means what? Is it just the beauty contest? Or is it like, well, if I don't get it, I go to the neighbor?
I guess we're gonna have to interpret.
Can you ask that?
Yeah, because it's just a Q&A. I just received a message. They cannot check with it. I'm so sorry.
Can you read this again?
Yes.
Sorry.
Do welfare states in neighboring countries compete with each other with respect to the promises they make about delivery of services to their populations? Like my welfare state is better than your welfare state.
Any other questions? Maybe we can take another. Yes,
Thank you very much for that fascinating, the fascinating talk. I was quite struck by what Professor Collignon said earlier about this very interesting link between higher redistributive spending and more individualistic societies. And it struck me that this might be tracking something about the cultures. In other words, that the government in Europe does what might happen in the developing world within the family. So families are obviously in the wider sense of cousins and aunts and uncles. So maybe if we framed this as, if we framed welfare spending as in some sense picking up the slack that because of atomization of society or a more individualistic society doesn't place as much stress on family structures helping one another out. So if we framed it as picking up the slack, well, might that imply that we would need to broaden out the data to include structures of private spending and finance as well as public ones? Would you see any virtue in doing that? Thank you.
Well, Mina, maybe you start.
Yes, about beauty conditions of the welfare states. Of course, that has been the core argument in the European Union. The fear of race to the bottom, also the benefit tourism, especially when the Eastern European countries joined the European Union. One of the big fears was that there was this humongous, welfare shopping, basically, that the people would move to another country just because. I think most of the research shows that it has not been a fundamentally a big question in the sense that we didn't have the situation that was feared, that people would really move massively. Of course, there's employment migration, but it is also in many countries that the welfare state regulation has become such a, let's say, chauvinistic one, that it is quite difficult as a migrant, especially if you come outside of the European Union, to be able to profit from the welfare states. So in that sense, it's not very attractive to move to just in order to get to the welfare state benefits. Of course, there is some shopping around. I mean, many of my colleagues, especially or my friends who have studied nursing, they would rather go to Norway than to stay in Finland because the salaries are so much better. So they are different kind of shoppings of the welfare state, but I wouldn't consider that as a main aspect. But you might disagree.
Well, in this case, regarding the first question, I just have a gut feeling that where capitalism and neoliberalism also finds competition as the optimum for growth and production and performance, especially in a first phase Schumpeterian system, let's put it that way. I really think that we may envision competition just to increase the amounts of services and in-kind and cash benefits that a welfare state can give to its citizens. And I really think that in this case, welfare competition could be welcome and not a beauty context, but it could be interesting to have certain also normative incentives in terms of also soft power and reputation, so that your country is known to treat people more fairly than other countries. I think that this is good. This is actually a good way of framing it if you frame it that way. Regarding actually the parallel that's been done by Joseph on the family relating to the developing world and the government on the developed world. What's actually striking is that this intuition may also go against some of the social policy literature that looks at the Southern or Mediterranean welfare state as being a family-oriented welfare state. So also within industrialized countries, in terms of OECD membership or other things per se, we can see that there's a big role of the family that is also very supportive of the government. What really actually, in my studies, defined the difference between Nordic welfare states and Southern European welfare states is that, firstly, the family addresses many problems that the government leaves open in, or tends to leave open in Southern European countries, whereas families are more residual in Northern European countries and Nordic countries especially, because the government steps in so much more. And on the one hand, this also happens culturally, and this reflects also on the welfare state. So in Southern European countries, usually, well, traditionally, the family was the unit recipient of welfare. So Italy is highly skewed on pensions, especially on this, as I can say, so that the grandfathers or the elderly members of society kind of have their own well-being trickled down to their own family. This also happens culturally, where in Nordic states, the children leave their family sooner than in Southern European countries. And so therefore, these are things that we can see moving both culturally and economically. And definitely in least developed countries or emerging markets, they could be associated to a lower intervention of the state, and therefore the family steps in as a mechanism of insurance. That could be really interesting, but maybe that addresses only a part of your question. The other part I didn't write, so just get content with that for now. Any other question or contribution on this?
Now, on the cultural thing, just a little anecdote. I once worked for a few months in a research institute, University of Oslo, Norway. And the director of the institute said to me, you know, the cleaner who comes here in the morning to clean our office earns nearly as much as I do. But I'm happy with it. She is happy with her job, and I'm happy with my job. I mean, this is impensable in France or in America or probably in the UK as well. You know? So culture does matter in all that respect. We see it in another area as well, because you talk about the immigrants and things like that. We've done a paper a while ago where we looked at immigration and the labor market. And the interesting thing is that you have in Italy, about 40% of the labor force are unskilled, which is your capacity gap. And in Germany, the unskilled force of the labor market is about 10% of the labor market. What is interesting is in terms of the immigration threat is, in Italy, xenophobia goes against the unskilled workers because they take away our jobs. In the northern country, Germany, UK, the xenophobia is we don't like these immigrants because they are parasites on our welfare system. And so, again, you see different cultures, but also maybe they come out of whether the transfers come from the family and then it's kind of de la vita, and we go to the state and then it's I have to pay taxes for this, so certainly don't do this. So I think the cultural effect are, how should I say, unintended consequences to some degree of how the system itself is structured. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure how to formulate my question, or if it's a question at all, maybe just a comment. From the perspective, as you were talking about, the support network from families and so on in the southern states versus the state in northern countries, there is another aspect, which is the support network from charities and society generally. So I come from that sort of background in terms of healthcare and support to patients, etc., etc. But you can expand that, quite a lot in terms of welfare. And I call it sometimes the unofficial or informal tax, because it's people who are suffering from X, whatever, who support those charities that support those people affected. So the reason I'm saying I'm not quite sure how to formulate my question, or just to address that entire topic as well, and whether it actually fits into the conversation or not. So that's it.
Thank you. I could say something. I mean, what we see that there are some countries indeed where there are very strong traditions for the third sector to be part of the delivery of welfare and well-being or welfare services. For example, Germany is one of the very good examples that the whole welfare state is strongly reliant on these sectors to do their job. That has also allowed that the state doesn't have to step in so fiercely. But what we see, for example, in the Nordic countries is where we have a very strong tradition of public services provided by the public sector, that especially from the 1990s onwards, there has been quite a high austerity. Also, that the state is trying to take steps back, rolling out of some of the services, whereas they are kind of trying to push now the third sector to take up. A very good example of that is, for example, the food banks, that they have actually become also in Finland as a very institutionalized organization that kind of tries to feed into those needs that the state is now taking steps away, and they have institutionalized their position in that. And we have also seen in the current, so we have quite a anti-welfare state government currently in Finland. I can happily say that. You can quote me on that. But basically what you see that they are also now retrenching the support for the third sector as well. So we're going to have quite a big holes in our welfare state when the state first left, and now even the charities and the third sector needs to leave because they don't get the funding from the state anymore. So it's a very difficult situation, and it will absolutely polarize the situation for those who have and those who have not.
There's an interesting chart I once saw. Ian Beck gives a lecture here for some of the students doing the disintegration course. Ian Beck gives a lecture where he has a chart on health spending, or like how much spending is going on health services and other OECD countries. And the interesting thing is that per capita health spending is pretty much the same everywhere. But what is different is in the US, 60% is public and 40% is private. And in France, 98% is public and 2% is private. So what is interesting in that is, like, in a way, the needs are the same because we're human beings. This is your equality, right? But how we provide for that takes different channels. And that's then the distributional issue. Any other comments, questions, thoughts? Yes, please.
I thank you for the very interesting presentation. My question is regarding growth and equality, and how those two are related. I wanted to hear your thoughts on the Kuznets curve and how release for all of this that's been discussed. Thank you.
Okay. So in this case, on the Kuznets score, this is a hypothetical curve that's also been shown to have some empirical meanings for an average amount of countries that follows the following argument. So that in order to achieve growth, you have higher GDP, higher goods and services, and things like that. And of course, at the beginning, with growth comes unequal distribution, right? Because the kind of real economic growth that happens is driven by certain sectors more than others, and then trickles down onto others. And therefore, as time goes by, inequalities should go up in terms of growth, initially at least. What then happens is that, according to the Kuznets curve, they reach a maximum threshold whereby you have important or significant growth that's responding with very high inequality. But after that threshold, the trend or the pattern is supposed to go down, and at last, higher growth should be in this case, increased redistribution of resources should follow up long term with growth, and also the other way around. So with higher equality long term, growth should spur in a different way. So on this argument, I quite agree generally, but there are scenarios in which this doesn't happen empirically. So the good growth, I don't really, we need to frame what good growth is, because I'm quite skewed by the Italian authorities to think that good growth is growth that doesn't really impact debt, for example, and that is actually a responsible and fiscally responsible topic. But maybe good growth could also be growth that is equal on the long term, and that therefore falls in the pocket of the main distribution of people in terms of percentiles. But good growth can also be for some, no growth because of the environment. So we need to set the standards of what a good growth is. My standards for good growth is actually a growth that ensures higher standards of living for people in general, so that follows the Kuznets curve, even if inequalities may pick up at the beginning. What happens with nowadays societies instead is that individual differences, especially with the top 1% or the top decile, have skyrocketed. And this has followed a trend of 20 to 30 years minimum. And some argue more with some other types of data. So in this case, I don't see the Kuznets curve going like this. In general, some societies more than others, definitely Nordic countries exhibit different types of response to this. But that's a very interesting subject. So in this case, the Kuznets curve is a simplification of what happens, but it's a very useful one. I wish that equality could pick up on growth. But Europe nowadays has a growth problem. So even on this, we saw that interstate inequality has leveled down, because developing countries after COVID, there has been an asymmetric shock that more developed countries have suffered more death per year in terms of COVID, and that reflects on definitely growth in terms of the panel of least developed countries for all sorts of reasons. And in this case, what's most important is that interstate inequality has lowered for this trend, but intrastate inequality in general has increased. So with this, we can also think about a growth problem, especially in Europe. I mean, especially in the Eurozone in general, and with certain countries, definitely. I could mention Italy not growing very much for the last 30 to 40 years. So there's major problems of economic growth that are spurred, in my understanding, by a lack of human capital and investment on human capital, among the many things. And investment on human capital can be proxied by capabilities in general. So accesses to other beings or doings. And this also affects the labor market and the economy in general. So that would be my response.
Mina, you have any thoughts on growth?
Well, I think you made really good points, and I think that there are many questions to be raised here. I think one of the problems, I think, where we need to discuss also with respect to is of course how to talk about growth in times of climate change and this biodiversity questions. And there's a lot of discussion, of course, on the eco-social policy sphere on that. I think there's nobody who is, well, almost nobody saying that we can't have growth at all. The growth is so embedded in the society and how we are structuring it. We can do things better. We can invest in green technology, and I think we need to invest, as David was saying, we need to invest in education and in people, but also in decent jobs. I think that is very important and under a discussed topic, that even though there is a very strong tendency towards pushing more employment, but what kind of employment are we wanting? I think Europe has been quite proud that we haven't had such a strong tradition as in the US, at least, with the working poor. But if I look at, for example, Finland, we see that there are really humongous tendencies towards zero contract hours and these kind of indecent jobs, I would say, which are on the rise, rather than that we actually secure decent jobs for everybody. So much work to be done.
Yeah, thank you. I think we could have a whole evening about growth. Mr. Helpman at Harvard, he famously said it's a mystery. And I think what he is rightly pointing out is that economists haven't got a clue what causes growth. I mean, we have models, like we have sand at the beach, but what do they really tell us? What can we use with? But how does it? It's like seeing is believing, believing is what we see. So in that sense, I'm rather careful about what I would say about equality and growth, because it goes in all kinds of. And China supposedly is the super example of having pulled out millions and millions of people out of poverty, which is true, but there are many other countries like where you also see very clearly that some policy regimes, they have to bring this out of poverty and others don't. In Myanmar and Burma, under semi-democratic government of Aung San Suu Kyi, poverty came down significantly. Now it's exponentially up again. So the political policy regimes matter enormously. Democracy matters. But if you look in history, go back to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, every time they had democracy, they had stasis, as the Greeks said, which meant that the haves and the have-nots were literally at civil war, killing each other, because the have-nots wanted to have land redistribution, which is asset redistribution, and the others didn't want to give it up. Now, the interesting thing about which I wonder about some of your data is when you have the data in the book about redistribution or inequality, Gini coefficient inequality on assets rather than on income. How does that vary? I mean, the global financial crisis, as bad as it was and how as much as everyone is electrified by it, was an enormous equality creating event, because I think at the time it was $65 billion of asset value that were wiped out. And if you had a job for, I don't know, $10 an hour, nothing changed. So in terms of the inequality, the rich became poorer and the poor didn't become poorer. So in terms of assets, that really matters. But then now the boom is up again on the Wall Street and so on. So these things are tricky, including the data now. What is to the benefit of David's book and his research is that he integrated it over a longer period. So you get more of an average development in that and so on. But all this is to say that these are all terribly fascinating, interesting research questions. And we are extremely blessed to be in a place like LSE where we can do this and where there is the brightest minds to actually work on these things. And in that sense, I would like to thank you all for coming here. It was a really interesting discussion and wonderful to have you. And I hope it has inspired you to do even better work in the future. And with that, I conclude this session here. Thank you.